Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We're here today as the Police and Crime Commissioner panel meeting on October the 12th. It's 10 a.m. and we're here today to consider the appointment of the Commissioner's preferred candidates to the position of Chief Fire Officer and Chief Constable of Staffordshire. Are there any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. I've received apologies from Councillor Roger Lees.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. Item 3 on the agenda then is the confirmation hearing procedure, items 1 to 4, and I'd ask the Commissioner to start the meeting off, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Morning, everybody. Been looking forward to this meeting. It follows really a very robust process to try and find excellent candidates for these absolutely crucial leadership roles in Staffordshire. I'm not going to say a lot about my preferred candidate for Chief Fire Officer. I am pretty sure that Rob will speak eloquently for himself, and I hope you enjoy this opportunity to ask questions of him. Great experience of Staffordshire, and for me a real sense of where we can take a fire and rescue service forward if it's to be an example to the rest of the country. So really, Chairman, that's all I want to say at this stage, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Members, when we get to the questions of the candidates, could you introduce yourself, please, and from which division you're here today representing, or whether you're a lay person or so that the candidates will know who they're speaking to. Okay then, well let me invite the Chief Fire Officer to make his representations to us, please.
Good morning and thank you for your time today. I'm Rob Barber. I'm currently the Deputy Chief Fire Officer for Staffordshire. I've lived in Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent all of my life, and I'm fully committed to the city and the county. I'm married with one child. My wife works in healthcare and my son is an elite cyclist. I joined Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service in March 1997 and have worked throughout the county in all operational roles. I've been a principal officer within the service for the last 7 years, and I've been the Deputy Chief Fire Officer for the past 5 years. I've operational experience at all levels, and I've operated at Strategic Gold Command level for the last 7 years. I've completed and passed the requirements of the Strategic Incident Command qualification, and I've been an incident commander for a number of major incidents in recent years throughout the county. From a national perspective, I've also supported the strategic deployment of Staffordshire resources nationally to assist with high levels of flooding as well as wildfires throughout the country. I'm also the National Fire Chiefs Council lead for waste fires and have developed a cadre of waste fire tactical advisors on a national basis. I've consistently met the requirements for strategic command and have participated in local and regional exercises at this level for a number of years. As well as the operational experience, I've also delivered a number of significant transformation projects throughout the service. These started with the business transformation team in 2010, which was a full restructure of Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service to ensure we had the appropriate resources in place to meet the demands and the risks that we were facing. I was the project coordinator for the Joint Fire Control Project in 2012-13 that transferred Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Services control with the West Midlands Fire Service and delivered that regional project on behalf of the service. I was part of the executive team that delivered the community safety options in 2015, and again that was a restructure of our resources. In addition, I also managed the work related to the change of governance from the Fire and Rescue Authority to the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner model in 2017-18 that saw numerous shared services being developed within the organisation. In order to discuss my vision, I think we first need to talk about the changing operating environment that the fire and rescue sector faces. We've witnessed a significant change in recent years across all three areas of our organisation: prevention, protection and response. Throughout the pandemic, we have been far more agile and flexible in the way we've delivered our prevention activities because we couldn't do face-to-face visits. This has meant we've been really agile in the approach. We've used technology to reach some of the most vulnerable members of our community, and I'd like to think that we will continue with that approach as we come out of the pandemic, because that's really added value to our service and to our communities. From a protection perspective, or fire safety, we need to recognise that the tragic events of Grenfell Tower are far-reaching in terms of the impact upon the fire and rescue service, both locally and nationally. And the fire and rescue service have a fundamental part to play in terms of the safety of our built environment. We will need to further reinforce our protection teams in order to meet this growing demand. And in terms of response, I'm sure you've seen recently the scenes globally from the impacts of climate change, the wildfires that we've witnessed in Spain, Italy and Greece, and also significant areas of wide area flooding. Locally, we're experiencing an increase in wildfires, and our beautiful countryside, both within the moorlands and Cannock Chase, have seen significant incidents in recent years. And in addition to this, we're seeing large infrastructure changes, such as HS2 and housing developments, which will also have an impact upon our service. We also need to be aware of the impacts of terrorism and the very real risk that this poses both locally and nationally. Understanding these wider local issues is imperative, as fire is often a symptom of a more complex root cause. There are so many synergies across multiple partner areas and overlaps, and in order to improve the community outcomes, we as a service need to understand these synergies and understand these overlaps. Understanding the issues and how they will impact on Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service will allow us to continue to be a proactive service that's been recognised nationally through our HMIC FRS inspection. So what is my vision? I want to ensure that if you live, work or visit Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent, you're as safe as possible. And by working collectively with our strategic partners, we can improve and provide this assurance to all. I want to ensure that our built environment within the county and the city is as safe as possible, whether you're a resident or whether you're one of our firefighters that has to access those buildings at a time of fire. They need to be as safe as they possibly can be. I also want to strengthen the local political relationships and ensure that our local councillors are fully aware of how Staffordshire Fire and Rescue Service are working to achieve the vision and how we can support you in your work. By developing strong, reliable relationships, we can collectively provide solutions to some very, very complex issues. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. We're very grateful for that comprehensive presentation. We'd now like to get ourselves into some questions, if we may. I'll introduce myself. I'm Councillor Bernard Peters. I'm chair of this panel, and I represent Burton-on-Trent, my division, Horninglow and Stretton. May I just start the questioning off with what are the main challenges in 2021 and thereafter, perhaps, for the Chief Fire Officer of Staffordshire? And are there any specific risks that you would like to share with us today?
Yeah, I think the risks that we face and the challenges that we face are intertwined. The challenge of a changing society and the impacts of poor healthcare, increases in obesity, increases in dementia, mental health provision is a significant issue. And you might think, well, what does that relate to fire? Well, as I said in the opening speech, the the fire is often a symptom of a more deep-rooted root cause. And when you look at our last 15 years of fire fatalities throughout the county, there's been 4 factors that have been prevalent in each and every one of those fatalities. That's smoking, alcohol, mobility or elderly. One of those 4 factors was prevalent in each one of those fatalities. Now, if I just dealt with just the fire alone, I'd only be touching the tip of the iceberg. I need to be understanding the root causes and how we can work proactively with our partners to reduce those incidents. Because as I said, we can turn out to fires, but if we just dealt with the fire and then left, we wouldn't be doing justice to our communities in terms of improving their outcomes. So by working collectively with the partners, I think we can reduce those risks. Some of the other risks, and obviously a lot of people will be wondering why I haven't mentioned the financial challenge that the service will be faced. I see that as a system condition. I have very little control over impacting on the finances that we have as an organisation. We have to deal with the funding that we receive. So although it is a challenge and we have to make sure that we've got the appropriate resources in line with the budget, I see that as a continuation of an issue that we've seen since 2010 onwards, and we need to deal with that. The other risks that I see, as we've said in the start of the presentation, are the changing climate that we see locally and nationally, because that is having a huge impact upon us. Our heavy, high-volume pumps being deployed to all parts of the country to be able to assist. I see that increasing. I see the increase in wildfires around the country, and I also see the impact of waste and the impact that we're seeing within the city in particular of large waste sites and organised crime being involved in waste sites, and that means we have to work with our police colleagues to ensure we understand the problem and we put the appropriate resources in to mitigate that problem.
Thank you. And perhaps just, I was wondering whether you'd make a reference to your relationship with the trade unions and what part they figure in your ambitions to move forward.
Locally, we've got really good industrial relations, particularly with the Fire Brigade Union, but we've got a number of unions within our organisation that are all recognised trade unions. And we work hard on those relationships. They don't just happen to be in a good place. We spend time with all the representative bodies and we make sure that we understand their perspective, but equally they understand the challenges that the Fire and Rescue Service are facing. We know we're not going to always agree on things, but understanding each other's perspective is the basis of developing those positive relationships. We also have to recognise that the Fire Brigade Union in particular have a different position in terms of that national approach, and we have to recognise our local officers and our local representatives will be influenced by that national picture. But by developing that relationship, we're in an informed position from both sides of the argument in order to be able to remedy and get to a negotiated position locally that meets the needs of their members but equally meets the needs of the organisation.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Let me open it up to questions from colleagues. Philip?
Yeah, I'm County Councillor Philip Hudson. I'm actually County Councillor for Utoxeter, but I'm representing the Borough of East Staffordshire today. What do you envisage will be the frustrating factors over the next few years in Staffordshire?
Frustrating factors. It comes down to, if in a utopian world we'd have a budget that wasn't restricted, wasn't reducing, and we could increase the amount of service that we delivered as an organisation, both from prevention and protection, which I think is vitally important, because I'd rather talk to people before, work with people upstream of an incident ever occurring than deal with the aftermath of a tragic incident. I've been to many fire scenes where you stood with a family and they're watching all their worldly possessions go up in flames. It's a tragic situation to have to deal with. Now, I'd rather work in that proactive, preventative manner to be able to stop their family being torn apart from the tragedy of road traffic collisions, fires or other incidents occurring in the first place. And as I said, that utopian world, I'd have numerous prevention officers throughout the county. So that is a frustration. But as I said, the system condition is what I need to deal with. And I need to be able to make sure that I use our finite amounts of resources available in the most appropriate way and direct those finite amount of resources to the most vulnerable within the communities, because I think that way we're stopping the number of families being torn apart from those tragic incidents that I mentioned previously. I do think, as I've said, the impacts of Grenfell again have a significant impact upon our provision of fire safety officers, and we need to make sure that we understand the impacts of the Hackett review to be able to put the appropriate resources in to deal with the risk. And our community sprinkler project is very much at the forefront nationally of protecting our residents. You know, and this did come before we started that in 2015, way before Grenfell tragedy happened. The Grenfell tragedy has actually focused the minds of local authorities and housing providers to be able to look at retrofitting sprinklers in the high-rise buildings throughout the county. And I think that is an area that I want to see develop over the coming years.
Councillor Jones.
Yes, good morning. Brian Jones, Deputy Leader of Cannock Chase District Council. Good to meet you today, Mr Barber. You've talked about your vision for the future. You're clearly Staffordshire born and bred, and you said you've spent 5 years as deputy. Stepping up from number 2 to number 1, what are your immediate changes that you see coming to the fore?
Thank you, and nice to meet you too. In terms of the second part of that question, I think the immediate changes that we need to make is there's some structural changes I need to make within the executive team, and I think if we are looking to make ourselves as efficient as possible, we need to look at ourselves first. It's very easy to say we'll make changes throughout the organisation. It's really important as a leadership team we look at ourselves in the first instance, because we shouldn't be immune to those changes. So there's a number of structural changes that I want to speak to the Commissioner about, subject to today going successfully. And I think thereafter, there are a number of other structural changes within the organisation that we need to align our resources to where the biggest part of demand is. And we often look at demand only. I think we need to look at risk and resourcing to risk. Because if you look at the demand, then you could say perhaps you don't need all of the fire stations all across the county. But you look at the risk, and we're there to provide that reassurance against the risk, then you do need those fire stations across the county. So I think it's a balancing piece that we need to do around where our resources are currently located and making sure we are using them in the most effective and efficient manner possible to protect all of our community members across the county.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Keith Walker, independent member. Since the change in governance, there's been a lot of collaboration and shared services between the fire service and the police, and you've obviously lived through that process. If you could go back to the beginning, what would you do differently?
That's a really good question, and I think whenever you do collaboration, you should start with looking at the work that needs to be done. And I said during the process, you know, very often we look at the method by which it's going to be delivered as the first part of the project. I think we need to flip that and look at the purpose for the collaboration in the first instance. The second bit should be how we're going to measure the success of that collaboration in terms of achieving the purpose. And then the third bit is look at the structure that needs to be put into place to deliver against that. So if I had the time again, I think we'd spend a lot more time looking at the work and the benefits of the collaboration. And I do think there's been some massive positives to collaboration. I really do. I think the scrutiny that the fire service are under now is improved massively, and I think that's a real positive aspect in terms of performance management going forwards. I do think there's opportunities for further collaboration, but I think we need to look at that purpose first, then how we're going to measure the success before we jump into where is Rob going to sit on a Monday morning, and where is Keith going to sit on a Monday morning, you know. They are the easy bits to do, but because they're the easy bits to do, sometimes we default to looking at that bit first. So they are the main bits I'd look at in terms of if we had the time again. I think we need to learn from every piece of work that we do. By becoming a learning organisation, you know, we all make mistakes and we get things wrong on occasion. We should be grown up enough to say we got it wrong and it isn't quite working, but we'll review it and we'll make it better. And I think the relationship that we've developed across police, fire and the office now is in a far more mature position than it was kind of 2017-18. So I think we need to build upon that over the coming years to make sure that future collaborations are at the highest possible level they can be.
Thank you. Leslie Adams, please.
Hi, I'm Leslie Adams. I represent City of Stoke-on-Trent. You mentioned in your little speech earlier on that you were keen to work with councillors and how that could improve our jobs and our roles as councillors. What does that look like and how do you see that panning out?
Okay, I think when we moved away from the fire authority model, I was a station manager many years ago in Tamworth, and the councillors that sat on the fire authority would come down to the station regularly. I'd have, you know, a cup of coffee with them on a weekly basis, and we'd discuss all kinds of aspects that were happening in their locality. Some of that has stopped happening, and I think we need to rebuild some of those local relationships. So I'll be discussing with our service delivery group leads and the station managers that sit within their delivery group leads about redeveloping, re-establishing some of those local relationships. And both on an informal basis and a formal basis, because I think by building a relationship, knowing somebody on a first name basis, being able to pick the phone up. If you've got a frustration, Leslie, for example, and you know the phone number and the name of your local station manager, you can deal with some of those issues that might escalate at a local level far more proactively than waiting till it escalates and then it has to get to a senior level. So I think, you know, by working at that local level on a regular basis, improving the relationships, making our stations accessible to everybody will provide that understanding. And it's not just fire, is it? We've got the joint facilities at Tamworth and at Hanley, whereby you can talk with our police colleagues as well. You can talk with the fire at the same time and our community members. So those stations becoming a true hub about community knowledge, because that's the way we start improving community outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne Edgeler, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I'm County Councillor Anne Edgeler, and the division I serve is the Stafford South East Division, but I sit here representing Stafford Borough. My question to you is, one of the things that you mentioned was your concern about the elderly, and I wonder how, moving forward in your plans, how we can protect the elderly in the situations that they probably find themselves in. And, you know, we've got a lot of people with Alzheimer's, dementia, and I wondered what your plans are to help the elderly as we move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, and we're an ageing society, as we know. More people living independently in their own homes because of the reduction in care homes, and we understand that as a risk for the organisation. You know, we're seeing a lot more calls for assistance, whether it be through what's a small fire, you know, leaving a tea towel on a hot plate, for example, and it causes the building to become full of smoke. We see those as our near misses. So every time we have one of those, we take the opportunity to understand those root causes. We can make referrals into other partner agencies, but equally, we spend the time with the individual to make sure they've got all the provisions and support that they need to make sure they're as safe as possible. And when we look at social isolation, it's a killer. It really is a killer. You know, it's worse than smoking 20, 40 cigarettes per day if you're an individual that's isolated and got no support networks. So by building some of those support networks and referring people into other organisations that can actually come into the houses and support that individual, we're turning off the demand from a fire perspective, which is great for the fire service, but equally we're ensuring that vulnerable member of our community is supported and got everything that they need, whether that's, you know, support through heating the houses in the winter. You know, we've seen various people, because they're wanting to save money on their heating bills, heating their houses in some really strange ways that's put their lives at risk. So we need to make sure that we're educating as much as we can, but providing that support through our partner agencies as well.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer. If you find people, you know, throughout your work, and say you're successful today, would it be possible then that you could signpost these people to councillors? You said about working with councillors, so we can actually pick the challenge up and then help those people as well in whatever needs they need. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we would, because of the development of the relationships, as I said to your colleague a second ago. I think, you know, you're a stakeholder, you're a really important stakeholder in that safety bubble that we're trying to create. And sometimes, if we haven't got those local relationships, you're almost not informed of the issue in your locality, and we need to make sure that you understand it, because you can bring in support as well. It isn't just the fire service that need to pick up the issue. We need to share that across a partnership, and those, you know, the community stations should become those prevention hubs, not just from a fire perspective, but from that multi-agency perspective, because that way, you know, people don't fall through the gaps that we've seen previously, and I think we give a better provision of service to our community members by having a wider discussion and more people around the table.
Thank you. Tony Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Voice might pack in halfway through this. I'd like to first offer a great big thank you from Staffordshire Moorlands for all the work you did on the fires that spread across the Moorlands area. How do you feel of forming a partnership with all planning groups within the councils? Because in today's standards of houses built and other places, you cannot get a fire tender onto some of the estates. So I would like to see one of your officers, if you feel it's okay, coming to planning meetings or being consulted at the planning stages. How do you feel about that?
I think it's the right and appropriate approach to take, and post-Grenfell, the Hackett Review has made some significant changes in terms of building safety and the fire safety bill. There is a new gateway process, gateways 1 to 3, that are being formulated at the moment underneath that bill, and there will be a requirement for the fire service, because we're not currently a statutory consultee. Under approved document B, we do get consulted on it, but it's just around access and water supplies, and sometimes it's too late in the planning process. We've seen locally, particularly in areas such as Rugeley, where we've had significant issues around planning applications that haven't considered the risk from a fire perspective. So I think that gateway process opens the door for that approach to be taken. And you know, from my perspective, I'd like our fire safety officers to be at the early stages of planning, because it protects the community members. But equally, if we do have to turn out to a fire, there's nothing worse than when you're trying to get to a property, the roads are blocked because of double parking, the access is too small, we haven't got the appropriate water supplies. It's really frustrating for our fire officers. And then, you know, their safety can be compromised. We have to, my priority is making sure that our communities are safe, but equally our firefighters are as safe as possible. And by being involved in that planning stage at the earliest possible opportunity, I think we get a better outcome for our communities and for our firefighters.
Thank you. Jill.
Hello, I'm Councillor Jill Hewson from Newcastle Borough Council. It's just going back to something that Anne raised in her question. When fire officers are going out to incidents or in the community, and I'll apologise if I should know this, but obviously I don't, do they receive training around awareness of dementia? Because potentially you could be the first people that will identify an issue with a person.
Yes, we do. We're a dementia-friendly organisation, and we run training courses for all our personnel, not just the operational firefighters, all our prevention and protection teams. Because, as you say, you know, pre-pandemic, we're doing 25 to 26,000 home fire safety visits or safe and well checks within the county, and a lot of those are opportunities for us to refer to other organisations. And as I said, that risk is increasing with more people living independently in their own homes. We need to be spotting those issues from a fire perspective, but also referring to our partner agencies, because they're the eyes and ears out there within the community. They all get that training. We refresh that on a regular basis, and it's vitally important to know, you know, from a personal perspective, it was really useful when my grandma suffered from dementia. You know, I understood the issues and the risks she faced when she was living independently in her own home. So I've seen the benefits personally that the training that we deliver is providing to our community. So we will continue to be a dementia-friendly organisation. We will continue with that support and that training, and hopefully that then improves the outcomes for our communities.
Thank you. Brian Jones again.
Thank you, Chairman. A comment and a question, please, if I may. I really welcome your comments to Councillor Edgeler about that partnership working, and certainly the Community Safety Partnership and the Community Safety Hub are excellent conduits for feeding that in, and I've seen that firsthand at Cannock Chase Council, so I welcome your comments on that. Secondly, my question, you obviously have to be operationally independent whilst working very closely with a commissioner here, where that could potentially put you into conflict. How do you envisage that working relationship and making it as effective as possible?
Firstly, thank you for the comments about the community safety work. It's really important and dear to my heart in terms of that position of the organisation. In terms of operationally independent, I'm a professional advisor to the Commissioner. The Commissioner might choose to take my advice or not take my advice on occasions, but I think it comes down to the relationship that Ben and I develop over the coming years. You know, we've been developing that relationship since May of this year, and that's been going really well. And I do think that by having that adult relationship where we can challenge each other, and I understand that we'll be sometimes in different positions, I've got to be able to understand the pressures and the objectives and the vision that the Commissioner's got, but equally the Commissioner's got to understand my position as well. And I will present all of the information for the Commissioner to be able to make an informed decision. Some of that information is sometimes going to be risk critical. At the end of the day, the accountability lies with the Commissioner, so I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't provide all that detailed information for the Commissioner to be able to make an informed decision. And as I've said, we make decisions based on the data and based on the information. It's then for me as a professional advisor to have that discussion and negotiation with the Commissioner to get to a negotiated position that we both agree on.
Thank you. Richard Cox, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Richard Cox, Lichfield District, and also a County Councillor. My question is around, obviously, our rural communities, and you obviously alluded to in your presentation the situation with the moorlands and obviously Cannock Chase being a risk. But obviously, in terms of the rest of our rural Staffordshire, with a diverse range of communities, do you feel that you are strategically balanced, that you are able to attend situations within those rural communities so they feel assured that they're also being looked after?
Yes, and it's always difficult with a finite amount of resources in rural areas, and as you know, we are predominantly an on-call service, so retained firefighters that do a fantastic job, and you know, they really do put their lives on hold to be able to provide that operational cover within those locations. I'll be really honest with you, on-call availability is a real problem for us in terms of nationally, not just locally. You know, it's a 1930s, 40s system trying to operate in 2021. It's really difficult. We don't have the families that stay in the area generation after generation and following their mothers or fathers' footsteps in terms of being retained firefighters. So it is a challenge, and that's one that we'll be discussing with the Commissioner in the coming months. We have to make sure that we've got those resources available to deal with the risk. And as you said, the risk is equally as important in those rural locations as it is in the city or in the bigger conurbations. Flooding, farming, rural communities such as that have a different set of risks. You know, I've been to multiple farming incidents that have been people trapped in machinery and things like that. You need your resources to be there as quickly as possible. So we are working really hard. We've got a 9-point plan currently being developed and implemented to try and improve the on-call availability. But I think it isn't one that's going to go away very quickly. It's a longitudinal piece of work that we need to really scratch our heads and think. Rather than just reinventing an old system in a newer version, we might have to go back to the drawing board and look at the system in its entirety.
Phil Hudson.
Yeah, the county of Staffordshire is very varied and diverse communities. How will you deal with communicating with our different communities in the different areas of Staffordshire and face up to the challenges that they may need dealing with and to give them the service that everybody in Staffordshire deserves?
Thank you, Councillor. Communications is always a difficult one. I always think back to whenever we have a major incident, and every debrief that I've attended, one of the learning points has been communications could have been better. And I think, you know, technology's improved massively. We've seen over the last 18 months, haven't we, that we can communicate in different ways. And I don't know about all of you, but Teams and other kind of platforms have meant that we've had to communicate in a different way. I think there's been positives and negatives towards that. And I think sometimes we've isolated some of our communities by thinking everybody has got access to those technological platforms that we all have had to get used to in our daily life. So I think we need to use all forms of communication. I'm a firm believer of liking face-to-face meetings. I don't know whether that's because I'm getting older or not, but I do think we pick up on a lot of the non-verbal communication when we're in a room. It's been very easy over the last 18 months if somebody's having a difficult time or a rough day to turn the camera off, and you can't pick up on some of that. But in terms of our communities, you know, some people like to access it through the digital platforms. Other people like face-to-face meetings. I've been the vice chair for the SCG for Wallis Quarry, for example, and I had to do some public meetings through a virtual platform that I found really difficult. Now, I know a lot of the community members would have preferred to be in a room such as this and look us in the eye and look at some of the other partners in the eye and ask some very difficult questions. I think as senior leaders we should be open to that, and we shouldn't just hide behind a 8x8 screen, you know, because that is an easy option. So I think we need the written communication, the verbal communication, and some of the technology uses in terms of our communication to be able to make sure that we reach all of our community members and don't isolate some of them as well.
Adrian Bowen, please.
Morning, Mr. Barber, and thank you for your time here today. I'm Adrian Bowen, an independent member of the panel. If I understand correctly, you said that your whole fire career has been in Staffordshire, which in many ways is a huge plus because it means you understand the patch intimately and in detail. Could also be seen possibly as a disadvantage in the sense that your experience has been narrowed by staying in one place. I just wondered if, firstly, you recognise that, and secondly, what, if anything, you would do to try and counterbalance that? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and it's a good question. As I've said, completely committed to the city and the county. I wouldn't say I haven't experienced other fire and rescue services. I work a number of national roles. So I'm the national lead for Waste Fire at the moment. I've just written the National Fire Chiefs Council Core Code of Ethics, which meant I have had to speak to every fire and rescue service in the country and understand every fire and rescue service in the country and their perspective. I'm also currently a board member for the Direct Entry Project, which is looking at entry into the fire service at senior roles from a different perspective. So I've been into numerous fire and rescue services across the county. I do have to say I've been asked to apply for other jobs within other services throughout the county as well, and I've looked at other services, but when I look at Staffordshire, I truly believe that we're one of the best fire and rescue services around the country at the moment, and I think I'd be taking a backward step by going to work in one of those other services. And as I've said, I've lived here all my life. The county and the city have been really good to me, and I think I can give a lot back to this city and this county. All of my family and friends live here, and I want to make sure they're as safe as possible when they're living, working or travelling to this county.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, colleagues, before I sum up? Mr. Adams.
Chairman, I wonder if I might just mention, before you sum up, the breadth of the report that's been prepared by my colleague Gemma. Gemma was on the panel along with Glyn and I when we interviewed Rob finally. He went through stakeholder panels, and I thank everybody from partner organisations who was involved there. One of the things you've heard from Rob is about this wider partnership approach to keeping people safe. So their involvement in that process was really valuable to me. Just want to make certain everybody understands that getting to this stage is by any means straightforward. You have to go through an extremely robust process, and I'm really grateful to everybody who's been involved in it.
Thank you, Commissioner, and be assured we've read the papers and we realise the vigilant approach that's been adopted, and I think that gives us a fair amount of assurance. Mr. Parker, it was good to hear what you had to say throughout that session, and that the sense of community needs was something that struck me, and your focus specifically on the importance of everyone in the community, regardless of who they are or whether they're fit, well, unhappy or happy. And the recognition, I think, which is an important point, of the need for an improved communication strategy. I think we'll particularly note that and we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. So at this point, I'd like to ask colleagues to adjourn with me into the room behind us, where we'll go through a period of deliberation, and we'll be back, I would think, within 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Mr. Barber, we are unanimous in our decision and able to ratify your appointment as Chief Fire Officer. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, councillors.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting you today. I think we'll now retire again before we see the next chief. And Mrs. Edgeler, excuse me. Good morning, everyone, again. We've now moved on to the item regarding the appointment of a Chief Constable. I'd invite Mr. Adams to open and welcome Mr. Noble. Good morning. My name is Councillor Bernard Peters, and I'm a County Councillor for Horninglow and Stretton, which is in Burton-on-Trent, and I'm also chairman of this panel. Thank you. Mr. Adams.
Thank you again, Chairman, and good morning again, everybody. Absolutely delighted to be here with my preferred candidate for Chief Constable, Mr. Chris Noble. I know he's looking forward to talking to you, and I'm sure you are looking forward to questioning him, hearing his experience, his plans for Staffordshire, and for me a really strong sense of what's possible for the very best police force, one of the very best that it could be in the country. In advance of that, I'd just like you to refer you to the report that's been prepared by our independent panel member to my right here, Mohammed Haroon, who's from your neck of the woods, Chairman. Mr. Haroon and Caroline Coombe, who's Head of People and OD at the Police Service, were on the final panel with myself, Glyn Dixon, and a representative from the Police College. And part of the process around Chief Constable recruitment is that we do have that independent member, and he was extremely valued, and thank you, Haroon, for partaking. Similarly to the Chief Fire recruitment, stakeholders were involved, staff panels were involved, personality testing. There are various hoops, jumps, chasms to be traversed in getting to this stage. So I'll just refer you on, Chairman, if I may, to Mr. Haroon, should you wish to take some of the detail from the process.
Thank you, yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chairman, the panel will have seen my report. I want to begin by assuring the panel that the recruitment and selection process for Chief Constable followed the principles of merit, fairness and openness. My report provides details of how these principles were delivered against. I can assure the panel that the people involved in the process and the mix of skills and backgrounds that they displayed meant that we had the right mix of senior experience and skills needed for the appointment panel. The recruitment process made sure that all eligible candidates were communicated with and provided with the information and support necessary to submit an application. The selection process made sure that all applications were considered properly from a shortlist perspective and then assessed through a robust process that ended with the interview panel. This involved personality testing, staff involvement and stakeholder involvement, with feedback from all of these prior to the final interview. The interview panel discussed all candidates and their fit and the competence before making a final decision. The selection of Chris Noble as the proposed Chief Constable was unanimously agreed by the final interview panel. In concluding, I would like the panel to note that I met the Commissioner and the Chief Executive at the point recruitment for a Chief Constable was being considered. I was then involved in all aspects of the recruitment process. From the perspective of the principles of merit, fairness and openness, I am satisfied that all requirements have been met and the best person is being recommended for appointment. Chair, I'll hand back to either yourself or the Commissioner unless you have any questions for me. Thank you.
No, I think, Mr. Haroon, the recruitment process from our own reading was comprehensive, focused and informed, and we are assured by that. Thank you for your presentation. Shall we move to Mr. Noble now? Mr. Noble, if you'd like to make your presentation, please.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, members. I've just explained to some of your colleagues this is not a deep Yorkshire accent, so my background is Northern Ireland. That's where I was born and bred 47 years ago, and 25 of those years I've been in policing. Critically for me as well, in terms of family, I've got 3 grown-up or supposedly grown-up children still back in Ireland, so hopefully they're able to watch today and enjoy my peculiar sort of blend of pride and suffering as well. So that's incredibly important to me in terms of them and indeed how they're progressing in their lives as well. I just want to take a few moments just to outline my policing experience and experiences. and try and maybe preempt some of the things that I think are important to you, Chair, and to members in the Chamber. First of all, just starting off with my experience in Northern Ireland, I had 21 years service in the Royal Ulster Constabulary and then in the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I had studied law in university, and my realisation halfway through that was I didn't want to spend my life behind a desk. And I've now ironically almost chosen to spend my career behind a desk as a senior police officer. That said, for me, in terms of my leadership approach, what I enjoy is being out and about, meeting colleagues like yourselves, your communities, and indeed critically my own staff as well. So that is very much part of sort of my DNA as a police leader. But joining the police in Northern Ireland was very much about adopting a new way of life, as it still is, still real challenges around safety of officers and indeed their families. So it changed my life and indeed changed the life of my family as well. That said, I think what it taught me, which I think is a universal truth, is that good policing makes a difference far beyond sort of statutorily what policing is responsible for. It does a lot more than just cut crime and care for victims. It can actually make places better for communities as well. So I see policing at the core of actually developing neighbourhoods and communities, not just the things that perhaps we have to do on the legal tin. And again, just to develop that, whilst perhaps policing in Northern Ireland maybe feels a very different place, compared to the challenges you have in Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire, it's very much not. The challenges for local people around crime and antisocial behaviour, challenges within communities around mental ill health and deprivation, that for me spans countries as well as even parts of this country. Equally, there was a real intense interest in policing from local politicians, as I'm sure there is and will be today and will be hopefully going forwards for me. And then a real hunger from communities for good, local and connected and relevant policing. So those for me are things which I think are common denominators across anywhere that is policed. I served as a district commander in both one of the largest rural commands in Northern Ireland, and then also was police commander for Belfast City, with many of the challenges that city still has. And even though I think our rural and town and urban communities have some very different challenges, for me again the similar ask is that they want a police service that listens, that understands, that acts, that goes back to talk to them again and tells them what it's done, but most importantly of all, involves communities. I'm a big believer in policing with the community as opposed to policing to communities, because actually communities know their environment and their challenges far better than many police officers ever will, and they've got a stake in seeing those challenges addressed. And one of my previous chief constables, a gentleman called Hugh Ord, some of you might have heard of, made a comment that, and I think it's very true, is that policing is far too important and difficult to be left to the police alone. And again, I think that's something probably will translate very well into Staffordshire about not just what you would need from me as a chief constable, but what I would need from you as local leaders and local politicians, and even more importantly again, from your communities and from partners as well. So I had a variety of other roles within the police service of Northern Ireland. I was head of professional standards for a force of 7,000 officers, and clearly the events of recent weeks show some of the challenges there are around culture and standards within policing. And I'm very passionate in terms of making sure that the police service does more than any other organisation in terms of the standards it needs to set. I was in charge of close protection for a number of years as well, including for Her Majesty the Queen and indeed other presidents across the country as well. So quite an eye-opening role, but a very critical role as well. And then I was the Chief Officer Lead for organisational change and improvement, including moving to a new local policing model in 2014 and 2015. I was also given the opportunity to be Service Lead for Community Engagement and also business crime, which is a real passion of mine in terms of how policing can support the business community, whether it be large or small enterprises. And then equally importantly again, around staff well-being. And on that last point, I think for me, if you want a workforce that cares for victims and for the public, they need to show and need to know that their leadership actually cares for them and looks out for them and protects them as well. So caring for those who care for others, again, is key for me as a Chief Constable. So moving on then to Humberside. Again, I moved across to Humberside about 4 years ago and still live in the area. I was an Assistant Chief Constable and then for nearly 6 months temporary Deputy Chief Constable as well. Real similarities to Staffordshire, very similar in terms of size. A quite large city in terms of Hull, which again has a lot of read across in terms of Stoke around embedded deprivation, but also a city which is on the front foot and very keen as well just to ensure that actually the public and the wider communities get a real sense about what it can deliver. And then wrapped around by some very large rural areas like East Riding of Yorkshire and North and North East Lincolnshire as well. With again, some probably I suspect quite similar challenges to some of your communities. On paper, maybe quite low crime rates, but real concerns around being isolated, response times, rural crime, and it's not just policing that perhaps has maybe been seen to have withdrawn from some communities. It's a whole raft of other services that are so critical for rural communities as well. So for me, the ability of the police service to be able to meet needs across those two areas is a given and critically important. In terms of the areas of responsibility within Humberside, I was the Chief Officer Lead for serious and organised crime and specialist operations, looking at how we support children who've been exploited, modern day slavery, and areas like roads and armed policing. And a common denominator for me again is the critical role that communities and partners played around tackling all of those. Police perhaps get the headlines whenever you see a drugs bust, or you're able to free victims of modern day slavery, but more often than not, the information that has been critical has come from communities, and actually the bits of the jigsaw have been put together by partners. I was also responsible for the Force Contact Centre, a much maligned and challenged part of policing, I think, and some of that is fair, and some of that I think is maybe a little bit unfair in terms of some of the challenges staff face in that contact centre 24/7. But in many ways, it's almost the new neighbourhood policing, because people nowadays, quite rightly, have incredibly high expectations of how quickly we pick up the phone, how well we deal with them whenever we do, and of course now there's so much contact which is digital as opposed to human. So that was an area of real focus for me, an area which was seen as failing, had very poor performance, and over the course of 2 years with a really good team working with me, we were able to turn that around to one of the best in the country as judged by HMIC. But it was a journey and there were some real challenges there. I was also responsible for how we respond and care for vulnerable people, and also then the quality of the investigations we deliver, probably two of the most challenging areas I think for policing today. And again, Humberside was a force which was really struggling around both of those areas in terms of requiring improvement in the language of the inspectorate body, and has now moved to a position where they have a very strong, good level of service being provided with a number of areas of good practice. What I would say is that the journey in terms of improving that response to vulnerable people and investigations, the journey was matched by going from some of the lowest staff morale in the country to some of the highest, as judged by the Police Federation. And I think if you want to improve the service to victims, once again, you have to improve the service that as senior leaders I provide to our staff as well. I think they're inextricably linked. I was also the regional lead for the 7 North East police forces for Brexit, and then with the local fire chief led the Humber police response to COVID. And just by way of recognition, as part of my journeys into the city and county over the last couple of months, one of the things that struck me has been the response that you and your colleagues, in particular in local authorities and blue light and health organisations, have made around COVID. I think the response has been exceptional, and that feedback has come from members of your own communities and a whole range of individuals as well. And I think Humberside had a similar approach, where probably more than ever, organisations saw the real benefit in terms of coming together and delivering for communities in a really tangible way. I think it was Mr. Henderson, who's obviously not too far away today, I suspect, talked about Staffordshire having fought a good war. I think the challenge going forward is now how, hopefully, as we move into peacetime, from a COVID point of view, we keep that momentum about how we've worked and how you've worked so effectively together. So again, an area I think for me in my new role going forward that I'd be really keen to try and develop and build on. Again, across both police services, whether Northern Ireland or Humberside, I've been a practising gold or strategic firearms commander, the same for public order and civil contingencies as well. And then on a national level, I'm the lead for policing protests. So more recently, I've been supporting the 6 police services which have the joy of the M25 running through their area, just respond to some of the protests, assisting them with national media, assisting them with coordination, especially as we start to move towards COP26 as well. So a challenging role, but one which brings me quite close to here as well, in terms of some of the challenge you have or will have in terms of railways, in terms of some of the local businesses which have been subject to some quite significant intimidation from so-called protesters. So I've been able to work with some of those companies in the last number of months already. And then clearly from my perspective, real opportunities to work with the Home Office, Department for Transport, the CPS and a whole raft of other organisations who are involved in protest. Maybe I'll just start to close in terms of a few comments about sort of my thoughts around accountability and operational independence, which I know is of real interest to you as a panel. Again, for me, accountability isn't an optional extra. It isn't something a police chief constable should be thoughtful about. It comes with a job, and in fact, it actually helps the job. Because from my perspective, the 2 core outcomes from accountability is around public confidence and public safety. So it's a non-negotiable. I've had experience of some quite challenging accountability arrangements in Northern Ireland, and then from Humberside point of view, a force that was in special measures with a rightly PCC who was deeply involved in scrutinising the force. So just in closing, why Staffordshire? Because you will know, and I think it's testament to the work that the Commissioner, the Chief Exec and their team have put in, that there was a wide level of interest in terms of the job in Staffordshire, which isn't always the case for Chief Constable roles. In fact, there was probably 4 or 5 in operation at the time. And for me, there were a number of things that not just attracted me, but convinced me that this was the place that I wanted to apply for and then come to live in. First of all, it was the approach and the vision of the Office of the Commissioner in terms of where they wanted to take policing, because there's no point 2 people coming together with very different perspectives on policing and what they want to achieve. And that for me came out very clearly in terms of how the process was run, which you've heard about from my colleague. Secondly, convinced by the people in Staffordshire Police themselves. They know that the police service has challenges, as every police service does, but they're up for that, and they're up for delivering a better service to the public. I think they are probably their own strongest critics, and I think that's quite healthy for a police service to have people who have a real passion and ambition to be better at what they do. And that for me was a massive point of convincement that this was not be something I would be doing on my own. There's a really strong team around me that Emma is leading very well, but also then that is supported by staff and officers on the front line. And then very much convinced by the place in terms of the environment you live in terms of the partners you have, in terms of how politics and the public sector engage with each other. And for me, whether it be universities or health or local authorities, as part of my conversations with people in advance, again, completely convinced that there is a real desire to work together to deliver an even better set of services for communities in Staffordshire. So in closing, the interesting piece for me is as we go forwards around an improvement journey and delivering even better services. Staffordshire has been here before. It's very clearly a family force, a creative force, and one of the best performing forces in the country. So I think Staffordshire doesn't need to look too far outside itself in terms of what's achievable and what can be actually delivered. And I've spoken to a number of the previous chief constables, and they're very clear that Staffordshire Police isn't a police force that stands alone. It's very much part of the fabric of local communities and local life as well. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Noble. That's very much appreciated, very comprehensive and detailed, and of course focused, which I particularly picked up on. We'll start the questioning, if I may, and I'd like to start by, you made several references to the challenges. I'd like to put some meat on that, if I may, in terms of the context. What are the main challenges in 2021 and thereafter for the Chief Constable of Staffordshire and the force. And I'd like to wrap around that the terrible headlines that we've seen recently about the community losing trust in the police in the light of recent events associated with a police officer whose abhorrent behaviour shocked the community, shocked the country. How do you intend to restore confidence in the police in Staffordshire, or get us back to where we were pre these awful events? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I think those are very much the questions of the day. So just to deal with challenges, first of all, I think that we've obviously referenced the challenges of the pandemic and how, whilst on the one hand it may well have assisted around some partnership working, I think clearly it's probably created some additional challenges around vulnerabilities within communities, for businesses, and indeed for the workforce of the police service itself. So I think the first key challenge is then how, as Chief Constable, I'm very thoughtful about what has changed and what is different and what needs to be done around the fallout from the pandemic, because my concern is that will translate itself into potentially more crime or different types of crime. We will see maybe increased unemployment. We will see some additional challenges around mental ill health and a health service which is under pressure. So for me, again, working with chief executive colleagues across those organisations, being really clear about what we see, what we understand, and then how we can work together to address those is important, so we don't work in silos. And I think that attitude is very much there. I think moving from that, I would be surprised if there weren't some very significant financial challenges for policing, and indeed for other public sector bodies going forwards. So even though that the balance sheets in various police organisations across the country might appear relatively healthy, I think we do need to prepare for cuts at some point in time, for less money. And how do we do our very best, not just to maintain services, but to even improve them, whether it be through using technology, working better in partnerships, ensuring that our people are held to account in a mature but an effective way. So I think the challenge of the phrase that we had in the past about doing more with less, we need to prepare for now before some of those challenges actually arrive. I think another challenge for us, just moving inside the organisation, for Staffordshire Police is having the right people in the right place. Again, what I'm hearing from the workforce, and the senior team are very aware of this, is getting the balance right between specialist resources tackling some of the most significant crimes, which thankfully happen to very few people, and then ensuring we have the right numbers responding to blue light emergencies, the right numbers within neighbourhood teams, and the right numbers of staff dealing with local investigations. So that is a piece of work which I know is ongoing. Emma and I met last night just to chat through some of the plans and what's going on. But that will again be a journey for the force in terms of getting the right numbers of people with the right skills into those roles, so you can see a difference in your communities. I think that the next challenge, because there's many, so I'll try and sort of keep them to the top tier. For me, and it probably goes to the heart of actually the second part of your question, is about the culture within policing. I think policing should set the highest possible standards, so I'm uncomfortable with saying that, even though I believe he was a complete and utter aberration from any police officer I've served with, in terms of the standards that the police service should expect, it should be higher than any other organisation. So the fact that someone like this could operate in a prison, in a hospital, in an education environment, quite frankly, is not my concern. My concern is the individuals who work for the police service, who we recruit, and who ultimately are part of the policing family. So the first thing that policing can do is stop individuals like this getting in, which means vetting needs to be as robust as it possibly can be. Secondly, then, the standards that are expected of police officers and indeed staff need to be of the highest possible standard, and that means not walking past things, because I have no doubt, whether it be this individual or others, that there will have been warning flags in play that policing could have picked up on. Now, it's always easy to be wise after the event, but I think if this has brought anything for policing, it's probably an increased sensitivity to what is acceptable standards. And very often, lots of things in the past have been written off as just police officers' peculiar brand of humour. Very often that can be an indicator actually if people, if they're not damaged themselves in some way, actually have a lack of regard for other people. So my expectation is, at a sergeant or a first-line supervisor point of view, there is a zero-tolerance approach in terms of behaviours like that, and they're picked up on. And that can be around prevention, it can be around identifying problems in someone's own life as opposed to throwing the book at someone and punishing them, but there can't be a tolerance for things which I believe policing in the past has tolerated. But coming to the second part of your question about the external confidence, I think the confidence starts with honesty. I think what communities value isn't excuses, even though actually there may well be explanations. It isn't a promise that it will never happen again, because whenever you deal with human beings, I'm not sure who could ever make that promise. It's an absolute honesty about what has happened, an acceptance of it, and then a really clear plan about how this will not happen again, around recruitment, around vetting, around engagement, around training of supervisors, in terms of ensuring individuals who are not up to the job or aren't doing the job in the right way exit the organisation with dignity at the earliest appropriate stage. And then it's telling the community what we're doing and giving them appropriate access to the work that we're doing, whether it be through the Commissioner's Office, through the Independent Police Complaints Body, or indeed on occasion through some more formal criminal justice processes. So, Chair, in short, to what's been a long-winded answer, I think policing has to have a real, honest look at itself and be very open about the challenges it faces, and realise that if any other organisation in the country, it should have the highest standards because of the amount of power that it wields in the first place.
Thank you. Anne Edgeler, please.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. I'm County Councillor Anne Edgeler, and I serve the Stafford South East Division. I'm also a Borough Councillor as well for the Bassage Ward. And can I just say, before I ask my questions, is a thank you to the police for the operation they did in Bassage over the weekend with the load of antisocial behaviour that's been taking place. But my question really is, if successful today, do you plan on vetting your police force, you know, in view of the light of the circumstances that's happened in the terrible murders in London, you know, women feeling safe on the streets and that? So do you plan on vetting your police force? And also, sitting on this plan for a long time, the main concern out there in the general public is visibility of the police. So my question really is, how will you handle that? And will you put more visible, you know, police on the street with the PCSOs and that? Because that is really one of the things for the last 8-9 years has been a concern with the general public. So thank you for that. Thank you, Chairman.
No, thank you. And in answer to vetting, absolutely, vetting exists already within policing. So for me, it's a confidence that the vetting is right, and it's looking at the right people and the right things. My concern is that whilst people have some degree of vetting whenever they join, it's the ongoing vetting which is done as well, and it's also the informal vetting, which maybe doesn't follow, you know, a particular process, but again, it's where their supervisor is picking up on concerns, on behaviours, on language. So whilst formal vetting in policing is now being scrutinised in detail by the inspectorate body, and whilst I will be very clear and want a confidence about how vetting works practically in Staffordshire, what I also want is a culture within leaders who are constantly vetting their staff and looking at what they're doing and challenging as well as supporting. I do think we might find some different thresholds and standards come out of the reviews that are going on, and I wouldn't want to preempt them, but I think whatever vetting you put in place, quite sadly, there will be no perfect vetting system. Certain individuals will either be able to hide what they're doing or will never have come to attention before. So that informal vetting of their supervisor for me is even more important, because these are individuals who will work with them, who will know them, and I would want to create an environment where actually colleagues within policing don't feel it's disloyal to talk about what a colleague has done. It's number one, being protective of them, because you have no idea what's going on in their life, and number two, their loyalty should be to the police service and the public, not to a colleague who's behaving in an inappropriate way. So formal vetting, absolutely. I will want assurance about how it currently works, as well as improving it, but that informal scrutiny and leadership from the people who know their teams best, for me, is what actually I think will make the difference. In terms of visibility, it's an interesting word. I think if I put a sheet of paper around now and asked everyone to define visibility, I might get different things. But I think at its core, and this is what visibility means to me, and I think then it needs to follow that we have a conversation both individually and in other formats about just defining it. Visibility for me is that people, first of all, know who their local police service is. They know how to contact them. They also have the opportunity to meet with them face to face. I know we live in a digital world. I'm a big believer that we're still all human beings at the minute, and therefore we need human contact and human interaction with the police service, so that's important for me. I want to see, in particular, PCSOs and neighbourhood officers at the heart of their communities. So actually they know where the key meetings are, they know where the key events are, they know what are the iconic dates and events within communities, and they're present and they can be visible there. Even just the use of vehicles and social media, there's a whole raft of ways now where you can be really visible even if you're not stood in front of someone's house. Because I've sometimes found that there's a dosage of visibility, isn't there? If you find a police officer in your street too often, you're probably getting a bit nervous about how your house value is being reduced because people are thinking it's high crime areas. So there is this sort of sweet spot, isn't there, where actually you know where your police are, you know how to contact them. When you pick up the phone, you get a good service. If there's an emergency, they're with you quickly. You know exactly who your local PCSO or neighbourhood officer is. They're part of the fabric of your local community. But in the background, even though it's maybe not visible to the human eye, you also know that they're caring for the most vulnerable people in your community as well, who you or your family at some point might need to call upon. And that is part of the challenge of policing. What the public want, what I want, is a reassurance that there's a local police service. But in the background, I know that society also needs and wants police officers who are going to deal with some of the most horrendous individuals, one of whom we've just referred to. But sadly, there's others out there as well, and lots of the really good work that goes on, either within Staffordshire Police or because of some of the regional arrangements we have around counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime. The feedback I've got is that there's some exceptional work going on behind the scenes that you will probably never, ever get to know about.
Brian Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Brian Jones, Deputy Leader, Cannock Chase District Council. Welcome to Staffordshire, Mr Noble, and I've been afflicted by my own accent all my life, so I'm sure we'll get used to that. A couple of observations on what you told us, first of all. How refreshing to hear a potential chief talk about looking after his staff. We've heard about Sarah Everard, and it's so easy to talk about vetting, and whilst it's really important, I absolutely applaud you for mentioning that in your open remarks, because we all know there's high sickness levels, both at the sharp end and in contact centres. Obviously that impacts on delivering for the community, so a chief that genuinely cares and puts in measures, I'm really, really welcome that, so thank you for that. The work also around contact centres, I think the Commissioner would agree that's a priority for him. The 101 service doesn't work great across Staffordshire, so I look forward to seeing, if you're successful today, what you'll do around that. So, to my question, obviously there's a requirement for you to be independent, and there's also a requirement for you to work with the Commissioner. So, how do you balance those two sides of that coin to have an effective relationship, please?
An excellent question. Excellent question. I think, and for me, I probably alluded to it. In the same way, I'm sure many of you, and I know that the Commissioner's team have done due diligence on all the candidates, I sort of did mine as well in advance, because there's no point getting involved in a relationship and realising you're actually two very different people wanting two very different things, because we know how that ends. So part of my due diligence was an understanding in terms of not just where the force was, but where the Commissioner and the team want to take the force as well. So in terms of working together, in terms of the common approach, around public safety, around public confidence, around partnership working, in terms of the local look and feel of a force, as well as the need then for those specialist skills that an organisation like policing needs to have. For me, I have a real confidence, and obviously the Police and Crime Plan will be with us soon, and that I think will probably cast in stone a lot of those key pillars and approaches, so I'm very comfortable about we're working towards the same things and want the same outcomes and approach. In terms of independence, I alluded to it before. I had some very interesting sort of political oversight in Northern Ireland, as you can imagine. And my view was that the critical element for me is respecting the democratic mandate, in particular of elected members. And that for me is a fundamental part of being a police service within a democracy. You represent communities, you're elected, and therefore I, as a police chief, or would-be police chief, have a job to do in terms of allowing you to do yours and reflect your mandate. But equally, I think any good politician and indeed commissioner worth their salt know that if you get too close to the operational decision making, you then become accountable for it. So why would you want to put yourself in that particular position? There was a phrase used whenever the transition from the Royal Ulster Constabulary to the police service of Northern Ireland took place around accountability, and it's the phrase of operational independence, and that's the phrase which is used quite regularly. I have no particular difficulties with the phrase, but I prefer what was presented at the time around operational responsibility. My nervousness around operational independence is that there's walls that are put up, there's a reluctance to share information or be open or honest, and the first time a commissioner gets to hear about something is whenever it's gone impressively wrong. That should never be the case. There should very, very rarely be any surprises in a relationship between a chief constable and a commissioner. So I think you're right. I think there is a tension. I think I've got significant experience of working in a range of different environments. I genuinely think, it's a bit like bacteria. There's good and bad bacteria, isn't there? And there's good and bad accountability. But I think good accountability, the public have a confidence that the police service are being held to account. They don't have a free rein. But equally, they have a confidence that no one's pulling the chief constable's strings, and they can't and they won't. Because once they step into that place, they become the story. And secondly, I've got a responsibility under the law in terms of how I discharge my duties. So, as I say, I've done my due diligence. I'm pretty confident. But equally, as you go forwards, there are formal checks and balances in that relationship as well. So, for me, accountability I welcome. Welcome the approach of the Commissioner in the office. But I'll be very clear in terms of what's my responsibility and ultimately what I have to lose sleep over at night and nobody else.
Thank you. Phil Hudson, please.
Yeah, I'm Councillor Phil Hudson. I'm a County Councillor for Uttoxeter, although I'm representing the Borough of East Staffordshire here today. And since I knew that you were coming along today, Mr Noble, I've really looked forward to meeting you today. So thank you. And you come across as a person who wants to roll his shirt sleeves up and get stuck in, and that's the kind of Chief Constable that I feel that we want in Staffordshire. And I really look forward to, if we ratify your promotion today, that to come along and meeting you personally and talking about the issues that we have. I live in a rural community, and obviously neighbourhood local policing is very important to us. What's your views on neighbourhood policing, and also what are your views on increasing the powers of the PCSOs? Because I find that a lot of them are beat managers, but sometimes they're a little bit frustrated when we have a situation that needs dealing with, and they're unable to do that because of the powers that they have at the moment. Thank you.
So in terms of views in neighbourhood policing, yes, it's a good thing, definitely. I think we should have more of it. I think in terms of how you define it is an interesting point, because I think neighbourhood policing is very often judged perhaps by the count of neighbourhood officers you have or the number of PCSOs you have. But, part of my vision for Staffordshire, and it's very much the staff vision to be fair, is that whether you're a member of the CID or the murder investigation team or the roads policing team or the response team, you think about the neighbourhood you're in. You understand its context, what's important to it. You leave it a better place than when you first joined it. So I am a big believer in what I would call specialist neighbourhood policing, where there's a ring-fence team. They mightn't be that large, but if they're dedicated to that role, they can punch far above their weight and the community will get to know them. So that for me is one of the building blocks of policing. Absolutely. Well, in fact, it's one of the building blocks of communities, not just policing. But I'm also a big believer in it can't just be left to neighbourhood officers to have a neighbourhood mindset or approach to communities. Every police officer and member of staff who comes into a neighbourhood or a community should think from a community policing perspective, think about solving problems, not just responding to them quicker. So that for me is critical across all of policing. Linked to that then, the powers of PCSOs, yeah, it's an interesting one, because I got a bit of time with Matt, who's one of your PCSOs in Constable, and without on the beat with him, I asked him that question myself, because I think I would start that conversation probably with communities and the officers who are patrolling the communities, because very often, let's take parking for example. Let's say we extend the role of PCSOs around parking. On the one hand, there could be real benefit because that's an issue that concerns communities and it's very visible. On the other hand, we know there's other agencies with responsibilities around that, and we know for every hour that PCSO maybe has involved in that, they maybe can't be doing other things within communities as well. So I definitely wouldn't be averse to the conversations. I'm very keen to take the views of PCSOs themselves around what they think, because I do know, not so much within Staffordshire, but within other police services, there's a thoughtfulness about, does that maybe bring PCSOs maybe into an unhelpful degree of conflict within communities? And actually they would much prefer to be investing their time elsewhere. So I don't think it's a binary question about yes or no around additional powers. I think we need to be clear as to what's the underlying problem we're trying to solve. Is there anyone else who maybe needs to step up to the mark to do more around that problem? And then secondly, if we did move to that, how would it change the time that those PCSOs or neighbourhood officers were spending elsewhere? Because we can't generate more time. It would have to be a prioritisation and stopping doing something else. But the big thing for me is let's have the conversation and then make a decision and then respectfully come back and tell communities and indeed the workforce about what we're doing and why, and that we keep discussions like that going on an ongoing basis. I'm quite open to that. I don't think policing can just close down conversations. It needs to make sure they're properly surfaced and discussed.
Thank you. Jill Heason's on this.
Hi, I'm Councillor Heason from Newcastle Borough Council. I think my colleague's just stolen quite a lot of my thunder. I was going to mention the community policing teams, particularly their knowledge and intelligence of local areas is invaluable. I just wondered what reassurance you could give the panel that in the future there will be a way of dealing probably more effectively with antisocial behaviour. I know that's quite a wide remit. But for that whole region, I think there are pockets of antisocial behaviour where the public don't seem to have the reassurance that the police are responding effectively.
Whenever I was speaking with the directors of public health across the two local authorities, I remember one phrase that sort of has stuck in my mind, that and it's relevant to think the antisocial behaviour or begging on the streets or a whole raft of other challenges that we see in our cities and towns. And the phrase was, your problem is someone else's solution, which I thought was really interesting in terms of just how you reframe that. So take, for example, antisocial behaviour. The problem we have, or communities have around antisocial behaviour, is probably someone else's. Could be a young person's, could be someone else's solution. So for me, each community will have a very different context. It could be around an off-licence, it could be around a park, it could be around rites of passage, it could be around some urban street gangs. So there's an element for me about what I'm seeing done well within Staffordshire and needs to be done more of, is around that problem-solving approach. We have the harm reduction hubs, which are very much understanding across partners. Why do we have challenges in a particular area? What's driving them, and how do we tackle them? Because I don't believe police can ever ticket their way or order, as in statutory order, their way out of antisocial behaviour. You need to get to the root cause of the problem in the first place. But it also needs a robust and visible response for communities as well. So even though there is a longer-term approach to understanding the problem, tackling it, removing maybe some of the raw materials which are causing it, equally, the public want to see something tangibly being done, and they want to be updated on it as well. So I think that would be my focus, more of what's being done well, but being very clear that we're not just moving antisocial behaviour from one street to the next, that we're dealing with the underlying causes, which very often, again, I think will come back to some challenges around parenting, around education, around deprivation, around drug use in a particular area. Because it is a bit like that game that some of us used to play when we were younger, whack-a-mole, where you can nail antisocial behaviour here, and guess what? It pops up 2 streets away. So I think the longer-term approach, whether it be in Newcastle or Cannock or Stoke-on-Trent or wherever, is let's deal with the underlying issue, and let's just not see it as a policing problem, even though the police need to be front and centre in dealing with it.
Sorry, can I just add to that? Would that include your town centres? Absolutely.
And again, one of the things I'm hearing is around visibility again, is the visibility at certain parts and times of the day is really important. So as hopefully town and city centres are coming back online, the police need to be present at those peak times around reassurance, intervening early in issues, and even just some of the basics about working well with licensees and door staff. That can make a massive difference and allow cities and towns start to breathe and grow again. So yes, absolutely, the nighttime economy in city centres, yes.
Thank you. Keith Walker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Keith Walker, independent member. You don't appear to have any affinity with or knowledge of Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire. How do you intend to acquaint yourself and understand the diverse issues affecting the communities of the county? And how can you convince the panel that you're here for the long term and that you're not just passing through?
Good challenge, good challenge. Well, first of all, I'll push back a little bit, if I may, in terms of no affinity. I have to say, for me, a job like Chief Constable, you don't come for the pips and for the big salary, even though it is a significant sum of money. You choose with your heart as well as your head. So I would not just pick a place for the rank or because I quite fancy living in the middle of England. So for me, the affinity is there already in terms of what I've seen around the place, around the staff themselves, in terms of what Staffordshire wants to be, as well as where it's come from as well. So for me, that there is already an affinity that's built for me around that, and I took about probably 2 months in advance to speak to as many people as I possibly could, just to get a feel for the place, as well as just reading the documents that anyone can read and try and pull apart. In terms of knowledge, again, some of that will come over time. You can't short-circuit understanding where a place has come from and where it is and where it wants to go, but you can talk to key people. And what I found is, and what I like to do, is speak to someone who's referred to me and then get references from them, so you can build your network and understand actually who is at the heart of communities, who understands what communities are about. Very often it's not someone with a formal title. It might be someone who's lived in a town for 30 or 40 years and understand how it works and how it ticks. And as Chief Constable, my job isn't just to do what I've always enjoyed doing, which is working with the local politics of an area. It's getting under that to almost the informal politics of communities as well, where you can really pick up the personality of a place, how it works and how it ticks. And actually, assuming you conduct yourself in the right way, those individuals are perhaps some of the most important advocates for policing that you can ever have. So that for me is one way, I think, of not just building knowledge, but building relationships as well. I think that's fundamental. I think the fact I'm going to live here will help. I think it will have another degree of stake and investment for me, and I think you do get to know a place and become much more invested in somewhere whenever you're actually one of the taxpayers within it. And yes, policing do still pay tax, absolutely. So there will be that contribution on a very practical level for me in terms of living in the area and working in the area as well. And in terms of here for the long term, I'm quite a simple soul. I tend to just think with what's in front of me. So my commitment and investment is Chief Constable at Staffordshire. I'm not thinking about anywhere else or anything else afterwards. And all I would say is, whilst part of my tenure might be measured by how long I stay, what I would like to leave, if I do leave, is a legacy around a really strong relationship between communities and the police, where there's a mutual trust, and indeed communities are proud of the police service that they have, that the police service is very much where it has been traditionally, a creative force, a front runner around performance. It exports talent, it exports good ideas, and ultimately it delivers an outstanding police service to the community here, because that's what they have had from Staffordshire Police before. So I don't intend to bring in stuff from Northern Ireland or Humberside just for the sake of it, because for me the brand of Made in Staffordshire is incredibly important. You've got some exceptional local police officers here, and for me probably one of the key things any Chief Constable can do with regards to their own life cycle and time in post is about how do you grow that leadership within the force, people who are born and bred and have an instinctive pride for the area. So as and when you or the rest of your team move on, you've got that talent and capability coming within who know communities inside out and have a real investment there as well. So a bit of a ramble, but for me it's about build relationships, spend time with people, and just have a humility that you don't and won't know everything, probably from year 5, let alone week 1. And I just think you've got to be open to other people being able to give you feedback and having a word in your ear whenever you need a word in your ear.
Adrian Bowen, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Adrian Bowen, an independent member of the panel. My question is about the public profile of the role of Chief Constable. not many years ago, if, for example, regional TV news wanted to interview a senior member of the police about an issue, it would inevitably be the chief constable who was staring down the camera lens. Now, of course, that dubious honour falls to the commissioner more often than not. So I just wonder, bearing in mind what we talked about earlier in terms of public concern a moment, particularly about the police, whether you see any need for yourself as a chief constable to take some measures to make yourself known to the wider public. Thank you.
Yes, I think, again, that's part of the reality, isn't it, of sort of modern day policing in an age of social media and digital media, that you do have an opportunity to be visible and known. All I would say is, and you can test me on my existing Twitter account, which I'm very cautious over, is for me, any chief constable should be very careful about holding a mirror up to their organisation and highlighting the really good work that's going on within there. I'm not the sort of individual who sort of craves the limelight, but I do know what comes with the job. I'm comfortable telling the story of my organisation, but for me it's very much about highlighting the excellent work that goes on within, as opposed to it being about me as a person. I'm also a big believer that whenever it's needed, the chief constable should front up and should speak to the most critical incidents of the day. But equally, at times, I think what connects really well with communities is their local inspector coming on to talk about an issue, because they have credibility. They live and breathe that area. They know the plan. The day after, they'll be doing the job. They won't just crumple up the press release and throw it in the bin. So I think you need to be very thoughtful about what's the audience, what message are you trying to leave. And as Chief Constable, I have no difficulty being in the limelight, but that's very different from craving it.
Richard Cox, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Richard Cox, Lichfield District Council, Cabinet Member for Community Engagement. I'm also County Councillor for Lichfield Rural West. My question is regarding, obviously, that vital engagement with communities. And I think possibly there is that perception that engagement isn't as strong as it could be. And I'm conscious of, obviously, my view as a cabinet member is to obviously rebuild and revisit that engagement to ensure that our communities do have that feeling that they have the confidence with police in terms of the engagement, knowing that you're there. And secondly, in terms of rural crime, I'm very conscious rural crime is possibly, is seen as on an increase, where perhaps domestic crime is lower. So we've obviously got an issue out there in the rural communities that seem to be the easy target. And obviously that causes disruption in terms of farmers are businesses. So, of course, if there is affecting that, and it really is working with then those community as well. And I just really wanted to get your understanding how things are. And may I compliment you on your accent? I absolutely, as a regular visitor to Belfast, I've tuned in and speak very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So engagement and engagement for me begins at the top in terms of how the chief behaves and their engagement with partners and with communities quite directly. So I think there's something about me exampling to the rest of sort of my organisation about how I behave. So I'll be very keen both around external engagement, getting out and about, meeting across the various authorities, getting a sense of the various groups and whether it be businesses or communities, and just building up again my knowledge and experience of the area itself. I think as well, my sense, and this is from speaking to the sort of troops on the ground, is that actually across most communities, engagement by the core neighbourhood teams is pretty good. Not as much as maybe they would like, and not as much as communities would like, but PCSOs are clearly, a backbone of neighbourhood policing, and police officers then are very much able to use different range of powers and get involved in problem solving. I think I would come back to my other point, though, about engagement involving the entire policing family, and where a detective, we're a roads policing officer, we're an armed response officer, where response officers themselves see them having a role around engagement. And it doesn't need to be a 3-hour community meeting. It can be popping into a shop who's maybe next door to a burglary, having a 5-minute conversation about crime prevention advice, anything going on in the area, have they seen anything? So there's lots of ways you can engage with communities which don't need you to be a dedicated neighbourhood officer. So I think that there's something really clear about the mindset of policing, seeing engagement as just how they do business. And then clearly there will be opportunities through the more formal arrangements, criminal justice boards, community safety partnerships, where again that engagement can have a really clear purpose to it as well. Because I'm very clear that policing, whether it be around visibility or engagement, needs to have a really clear purpose and outcome behind it as well. It's great to have conversations, and that can build relationships, but I think communities want to see delivery as well. So it's engagement with purpose in terms of what we do. Around rural crime, I absolutely get the challenges. Again, having been a district commander for 3 years in a very large rural community, even though, well, first of all, rural crime as a definition is a difficult one. You know, is it a crime that happens in a rural area, or is it something quite bespoke to farming communities themselves? And it's obviously both. But one crime in a rural community can stay in the memory of that community for years. So it punches above its weight in terms of statistics. Secondly, you know, the theft of plant machinery can be the difference between a business staying in business or going out of business within a rural environment as well, because of some of the margins. And then the feeling of isolation in terms of being distant, maybe from patrol bases, or knowing, as well as police officers do, how long a car can actually get to a call if it's needed. It might be that blue light runs are incredibly rare, but that doesn't really make anyone feel particularly more comfortable if you're the one who then needs it. So that ability to be able to make sure our resources are in the right place, to look at how we can work with partners, so there's support potentially from other agencies apart from policing, the quality of contact, the ability to follow up calls, the ability to give good crime prevention advice, the ability to support people who maybe been repeat victims. You know, these are all things which need to be part of a really clear rural crime strategy and plan. That said, the feedback I've got, and came from Ben himself, and I met Mark in the Moorlands and had a chat with him, is there's a really good rural crime partnership that exists. It's then probably about expanding that and actually telling the story of what they're doing, because there's a lot of work going on. Perhaps communities maybe aren't fully aware of all the work and investment that's been made.
Thank you. Are there any more questions, colleagues? Mr. Hudson.
Yeah. The Commissioner has quite welcomely indicated that over the next few years he wishes to increase the establishment of our police force, and we very much welcome that. There will be quite a lot of investment involved in this with our recruits. What are you going to do to make sure that we retrain these people at the end of their training period? Yes, retaining once they've been trained.
Yeah, it's a good challenge, and it's a challenge, I think, around just the diversity of the workforce that we bring in, because there's some really encouraging numbers now about a very diverse range of recruits that we're bringing into Staffordshire. But other police services have seen that fall away over time, either because maybe people don't progress. So whilst retention is a key challenge, I also think about moving people into leadership roles, maybe from a gender or a different minority ethnic background. If you don't keep them in the organisation, they're definitely not going to progress and going to become leaders. I think a lot of it, again, comes down to, first of all, being very honest with people about what policing is before they join. And this is difficult sometimes to pull apart fact and anecdote, but every now and again you hear people being surprised that police officers do night shifts. I think it's a little bit of an urban myth. I'm pretty sure most people know that they do. But there is something about, before you join the police, that we ethically have to be really clear with you about what we expect, that policing is a challenging and a rewarding career. And I think people who come in with that knowledge are probably more likely to stay within policing. Secondly, I think it's also being very clear with people as they progress through their career about what performance looks like, and holding them in a meaningful way to account, but also supporting them in terms of well-being. I think nowadays the things that police officers and indeed police staff, for example, in custody suites or call handling, the things they deal with every shift are things that probably the rest of us mightn't deal with in a lifetime. So the need to retain people and keep them well is critically important. And we talked about this earlier on, looking after them as human beings, as well as the fact that they will then deliver a better service for the public, is key to retention. And the final thing is having meaningful and honest conversations with people who leave policing and understanding why. I would personally want to speak to every single officer or staff member who leaves Staffordshire, so they can be honest with me, because most people are when they're walking out the door, about exactly why they're leaving and what the issues are. And that is incredibly important, and then feeding that back in around their experiences and what hasn't worked. And in particular, if there's certain groups that we're losing proportionately more than others, that would greatly concern me as well, because policing can be more flexible than it currently is without missing the ability and the need to deliver for the public as well.
Thank you. Colleagues, are there any more questions? No, thank you. Mr. Noble, your awareness and commentary around community needs in terms of accessibility to the police are very important to us all in Staffordshire. And I'd like to thank you for your presentation and the way you have answered our questions today. Very much appreciated. Thank you. I think now then, colleagues, will retire, deliberate, and we should be back in 10 minutes, I would think. Thank you. Right, thank you. Thank you very much. We're back now, Mr. Noble. And Mr. Noble, we have unanimously agreed and are able to ratify your appointment as Chief Constable of Staffordshire. Congratulations to you. And thank you for your attendance today, everyone. I declare the meeting now closed.